It is a huge pleasure for me to introduce our George Chakravarthi, a multidisciplinary artist who draws inspiration from a diverse range of lived and inherited cultures, histories, and identities. George studied at the University of Brighton, the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal College of Art, amongst others. He's performed and exhibited nationally around the UK, Tate Modern, the V&A, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and internationally in Germany, Spain, Norway, Netherlands, Austria, USA, and India. You can read his full bio and hear more. You're going to hear lots more and see more of his extraordinary work. But it's actually, I was just going to really finish by saying it's only about 18 months since we met, George, I think. And EJ Scott from the Museum of Transology introduced us and said, you've got to get together, you'd have lots in common. And we started chatting, and George invited Cesare and I to your studio to see your work, a body of work, and have a conversation about your practice and our interest in animating heritage sites and stories by working with amazing artists like George. And we just a lovely relationship has unfolded, and it's been brilliant to get to know George and their work. So you'll hear more about that now. I'm going to hand to George, who's going to introduce a film, which we'll watch for about 20 minutes or so, then we'll pause, have a bit of a chat, and then finish off with the final clip. So that's the format for today. Will we use this one still? I'll pass to you, George, and you can tell us a little bit.
Thanks, Richard. So thank you for having me, and thank you for all the great work that you're doing. So we're watching a showreel of my work, so from pre-art school years to current practice. So there are a selection of works spanning over 30 years. There is explicit language, so I should say that. And there's also narration on it, so I can relax and watch it and we'll have a little chat. I'm going to start with some early images that I made in photo booths. So this would have been around 1986-87, and I would have been in my mid-teens. I remember spending a lot of my time wanting to challenge the perceptions of what it was to be me. First-generation immigrant, queer, feminine, dark-skinned, and a South Indian. I did this by doing extreme things to my appearance so I appeared undefinable in some way. Thinking about it now, I think it was more of an act of rebellion and confrontational, a bit punk-like, anti-establishment, and deeply political in its sometimes naive and fun way. I would often take a bag of props and a few pound coins to the post office where this particular photo booth was and make these images. There wasn't much time between the shots, so everything had to be pre-planned. And these are just a few of the many strips of images. It was like keeping a visual diary with no particular goal. I eventually got my own camera, and this was a huge turning point because now I could make these images in the privacy of my own flat with no time restriction. It also meant that even though I was still fueled by the same questions about identity and the body in relation to a particularly racist time in the 1980s, I was now able to make more complex images in the safety of my own home. So by the time I got to art school in the mid-1990s, I was really quite established in my interests in visual language. What I needed and what art school gave me was an audience, critical dialogue, and access to more equipment and space. This particular series of doubles comes from that time. I became interested in splitting the body or expressing the many facets of gender and identity, which may not always be visible. I also discovered moving image, which gave me another medium to explore. It also became apparent that there was very little documentation of Asian artists, especially queer artists who come from a very unique range of experiences and intersect many frameworks and subcultures. These were things that I was starting to think about during this time, which is why I decided to keep my presence at the centre of the work, so that there's clear visibility of the subject and no uncertainty of authorship. Also to express some humanity and lived experience in the work within an area that's somewhat been hijacked by intellectuals and academics. And that hasn't changed since, and my presence continues to be central to the work. It also became really important for me to include my cultural heritage in my work, so that it isn't lost in the generic European debates about gender and sexuality. This is a video piece called Remote Control, which I regard as a seminal moment of transition. It was made during a time when I decided only to focus on my body, and this piece looks at the gendered body through a series of yoga asanas. Heritage and biography brought me to make The Last Supper, and this was the first in a series looking at the performance and symbolism in paintings from art history, reconstructed to include biographical elements of my multi-faith upbringing, which has been a mixture of Catholicism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. The subversion also raises interesting questions and creates new readings of the iconic painting. And this was a live performance piece and a life-size photograph. I continued to place myself within these iconic paintings from art history with a piece called Shakti, a hybrid of the goddess Kali and the Mona Lisa. This is an hour long and filmed in real time, so it references meditation and the very slow act of painting. There are 6 phrases which occur every 10 minutes, and it's shown projected the same scale as the Mona Lisa, which is 77 by 53 centimeters. I used to call these works paintings that never dry, because they're always moving and never fixed. In 2002, I was commissioned to make a piece called Barflies. Barflies is a triptych video installation with me as 3 different trans people in 3 different bars. I place myself as these 3 personas in different straight pubs and clubs. The camera records my interactions with the people who encounter me and come into the frame. Technically, there's a small DV camera which is placed by the optics, and it documents an hour of the action. The soundtrack is taken from live recordings on a telephone chat line where people are seeking to meet or engage with various types of trans people or alter egos. The soundtrack is mostly very sexual, but it also becomes very confessional and moving at times.
You have a message from
Sleazy Tarty TV. Hi, it's Jane here, very tarty, sleazy looking glamour model TV. Offer absolutely anything special for another.
to ignore it. You have a message from
David, 38, bisexual, West London. Well, I definitely love the sound of you. Love the sound of your sexy voice as well. Well,
You have a message from
Good looking young guy. You're right, this is Tom, good looking young guy, calling from London. The line for fun, my number's 079.
You have a message from
Sharon from Gloucester. I don't know, it's Sharon Jasmine, the flip puss.
You have a message from
Hi, it's Jane in Hounslow. Hiya, Jasmine, or as you say, sexy TV. Oh, I love the voice, darling. Well, hello. Right, okay, it's your agony aunt of the chat line here. It's Auntie Jane. Right, well, let me tell you a bit more about myself. I'm 48 years old. More mature tranny, darling. Figure to match, I hasten to add as well. Oh dear, things have gone south. You know how it is amongst us girls. But I'll be 49 next month. I'm about 5'7", 5'8" tall. Long black hair, all my own, going grey with natural highlights, so no sniggery. Otherwise it's claws out and handbags at 6 paces. I take about a size 18 to 20. I am slowly losing weight. It was something I consciously decided on last summertime. I thought, God, I'm getting like a barrage balloon. I've lost 3.5 stone so far without much trouble at all, so I'm doing well. But what else can I tell you? Yeah, blue eyes, great sense of humour. Can be the life and soul of the party when I really get going. In the downstairs knicker department, you know, it's 6.5 inches, quite thick uncut. Get no complaints there. On the sex side, I like my sex slow and passive and gentle. I don't like any rough stuff whatsoever. I get very upset if people do that to me. That was due to a bad experience about 10 years ago, but more on that later if we have a good girly goss. I love, one of my main loves and one of the first things that got me into cross-dressing was I absolutely adore classic foundation wear and corsetry. I've got loads of it. I must have about £1,000 worth by now. But so this collection that I have has been building up and still building over about the last 7 or 8 years. Some of my wardrobe got destroyed last year by my ex because he was a bi guy. And although he said he accepted me as being a tranny, he obviously didn't, because he decided to rip my clothes apart one night with a bloody kitchen knife. So, you know, it's been a bit tough, but I'm sort of online here, basically out to talk to trannies and make new friends and meet the girls and have a good laugh and so essentially just be friends. You know, so if the perfect one's out there, then it's going to be a long-term one-to-one, because I want a long-term relationship at the end of the day. But also, oh dear, well, there's something else as well. Oh, I think I may have met my perfect man. Yeah, let us know, yeah.
Once again, I return to reference painting with Olympia, a subversion of Manet's painting with me as Olympia, a brown, sexually ambiguous nude with a white male servant. This is also an hour long and filmed in one take. This was a live piece called Miss United Kingdom, an archive. This was part of a bigger show produced by Ducky, and the theme was Rule Britannia. I was really interested in the British beauty queens of colour who've perhaps not been celebrated as much as their counterparts, and I was particularly looking at the years when some of them had won, 1966, 1975 and 1994. This was essentially a nightclub posing piece with serious undertones, which the audience either engaged with or just enjoyed the glamour and the absurdity of beauty competitions. In 2011, I was invited by the Royal Shakespeare Company to create a project, and I went back to stills photography. I chose to focus on the theme of death in Shakespeare, especially suicide, as I felt it was important to talk about the presence and longevity of suicide in Shakespeare's plays as an act of courage, passion and honour, and to create a dialogue about suicide as an act of terror in our modern world. There are 13 suicides across the plays, and apparently that's where the unlucky 13 comes from. It was also really interesting to occupy an English heritage space as a queer, brown artist and assume these roles from English literature. And these are large-scale geotrans embedded in light boxes. Coming to more recent works, this is the ambidextrous universe, an ongoing visual research which began after a short but very intense illness. I had an unexplainable infection which left me almost paralysed for over the course of 6 months. I spent all my time in bed and in pain, which brought a new and intense awareness in my consciousness. When I recovered, I started making this work, which looks at the body as a fragile, decaying and renewing structure. It also refers to the processes and seasons of botanical matter, alignment, symmetry, sacred geometry, and other spiritual forms. So somewhat moving away from form identity and towards essence identity. Unlike much of the work where the process has been building on the body and working from the outside in, this work somewhat reverses that process and works from the inside out. I've continued making this work, looking at the mystical and esoteric traditions, particularly related to the body, time and nature, ancestral memory, and tribal art. I've also started painting, which is evolving alongside this photographic work. I continue to make live work, most recently an Indian in a Box, a live durational performance installation looking at the history of human zoos, a shameful practice that endured during the colonial era. Caged and bound in European garments, I present myself as a creature of curiosity.
It's brilliant to see. It's brilliant to see that again, George. It's like probably a year now since Cesare and I got a taxi back from your place, and we're very excited. We could see in that work and in the journey that you've kindly narrated for us such a sort of body of work that holds real relevance to our interests, I think, in the room today. So we'll sort of unpack that a little bit now. But I mean, I think for me to see the work's really so much sort of beauty in that work, but also what strikes me is it feels very deeply researched and resolved in a way that maybe speaks to our first question. So the first one really is about the role that you think museums and heritage, that's our real focus in the room today. What do you think museums and heritage, what role can they play in advancing queer liberation or LGBTQ rights and equality?
Thanks, Richard. Well, I think museums have been in the closet for far too long, and it stopped us from inserting our own histories in those spaces. So support the work, but we also know how dangerous it's become to support queer identities, because we're so much under attack at the moment, especially marginalised queer in the queer community. So standing up and supporting the work has become like a radical act, which requires really courageous people in positions of power to commit to doing that work, I think, because there's queer history in every part of the museums. It's just about integrating those things, those overlapping histories, which have been either overlooked or sanitized. So it's really about re-looking at those collections through or beyond the heteronormative lens, and also to remember that museums belong to all of us.
Thank you. There's such a lot in there, George, and it really sort of speaks to the roots of the network and where we're the point that we're at. So you sort of said about the importance of cultural organisations standing up and supporting the work, and I think there's just been this real moment in, where are we, sort of 4 or 5 years of the network. So I was chatting to some of you and reflecting on, we had enormous interest from the call for papers, and we sort of, some of us on the steering group were saying, gosh, maybe 5 years ago there was in small pockets, we knew quite a lot of the practice that was happening. It was really quite very sort of nascent, very emergent, and now there was this sort of burgeoning field, but it's never feels fully linear to me. We sort of sometimes jump in and have some advances and some successes, and cultural organisations can often celebrate those, and rightly so when that happens. But there have been difficult times, I would say, the last couple of years, and certainly in the research centre, we've never spent so much time in sort of planning and comms meetings around projects because of what's now become quite predictable around a sort of backlash, which can be really hard for organisations to weather. Online, social media, or even real life protests are all we've all seen or encountered them across all sorts of cultural organisations, and that's sort of undeniably unpleasant work for cultural organisations to get into. But for the artists and communities they've worked with, there's sort of so much more at stake than maybe discomfort or organisational reputation. So I sort of think there's a big lesson in what you say when you ask us to follow through really with our interests. It is a burgeoning field. There's a lot of possibilities, a lot of work that can happen, but it isn't always straightforward, and finding ways to stay the course and not do a disservice to our queer collaborators and partners who are not necessarily part of our day-to-day work feels important. So thank you for bringing that to the surface. I'm sure it's going to come out as well in the symposium. So a second question is really about artists and art practice, what that can bring to our work in museums and heritage. So when we're trying to take forward queer heritage in organisations like this and others that are represented in the room, what is it, do you think, and from your experience, that art and artists can bring that's maybe different to some of the other skills that we might already have in museums?
Well, I think queer artists bring many unique histories, sometimes personal histories, which raise really interesting questions about what we value and contain in these beautiful buildings. And we often engage on an emotional register, as well as an intellectual one. So they can be expressions of anger, sadness, joy. Or anything that kind of disrupts the status quo. So we can act as disruptors, which, and just sometimes it's disrupting the history of how we consume certain things. And perhaps sometimes we can do what curators can't do, like act as the court jester or take risks, which they may not be able to do. So I think queer artists bring a heartbeat to large cold spaces and they kind of bring a humanity, and they kind of humanize our experience of being in museums. I mean, I myself have been gate crashing so many different cultures and spaces, which is really challenging. But I think it's really, really important for our evolution, all of us. So yeah, and we often change the people we work with, which is always a good thing.
Thank you. There's so much in that, really, isn't there, around our skill set and resources, but what's unique in our collaborations with artists when that goes really, really well. I love that idea of a sort of core jester or disruptor, because some of us can feel there are all sorts of limitations, aren't there, inside organisations that are deeply frustrating, and getting close to that humanity and finding a way to let that infuse what we do. So that idea of a heartbeat is lovely. I also think your point about the disruption leading to sort of change in the organisation is a kind of good one. It's lovely to be back at HRP. I was reflecting with some HRP colleagues, a project the Research Centre did with some other partners and with Hampton Court, called Permissible Beauty, which had artists, black queer artists at its heart. And around that project, we sort of had to put things in place to try and enable those perspectives to flourish, because even, and it comes from the Research Centre as well, sort of well-meaning, but conventions about the way we do things can knock the edges off the heartbeat and the humanity. We can sort of put things into boxes, and we just had on a brilliant journey with the HRP staff around that project. And Matthew's in the room, I think, and will remember we'd sort of developed some protocols to help us hold and really attend to that artist's perspective, created these kind of tools to help us. And we kind of said, what's going to happen when we get going and the sort of heritage machine takes over? How do we preserve some of that? And so the HRP staff were brilliant. They said, we'll just put it in our contract that we've got to deliver, we've got to work in that way. Right. It was really fantastic sort of license for us and for the creatives to work differently, but it definitely meant that it did leave that legacy. You know, like some of those relationships have continued to flourish. Some of them are in the exhibition we'll see tomorrow, Untold Lives. And I think it's a sort of testament to the catalyst that a sort of artist can bring in a sort of positive way. You have any more thoughts about that from your own experience? If you left sort of traces in any of the organisations that you've worked with? Or,
many, not always good, but definitely an impact, and just, you know, making people think beyond, you know, those kind of parameters. Even as basic as painting the walls can become such an act of rebellion, because you want the walls to be a certain color to accommodate your work, and you have to go to a series of meetings about paint and walls. But it's amazing, because I think sometimes you light lots of light bulbs because people start thinking, oh, why are we really caring about this? What, you know, surely it's about the artist and the artwork, you know, and the best way to see that work in, you know, I mean, that's just kind of as basic as it can get. And obviously, you know, you kind of pass the baton, because every time I know certain spaces have never had an artist like me in them, but after I've been in them and kind of reassured them that it's okay, we're all human, we're all, you know, able to work together, and it's, you know, and subsequently there have been other artists making what they regard as, you know, dangerous work, or, you know, provocative work. So and that feels really good. That I'm so glad that's changed. You know, you're able to do that through, but you know, sometimes you have to take the higher road, and, you know, and think about the greater good rather than your immediate need.
Okay, thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes of a clip, which brings us a little bit more, even more up to date, in that lovely trajectory, evolving trajectory of work which you've talked us through. So we've got a short 2-minute clip, and then we'll bring it to a close for our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.